Recording in progress.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Hope everyone had a nice weekend, enjoyed the cooler weather. It was lovely. So today we're going to finish catching up from Friday. So finish our in-class assignments, going through that. Finish our lecture from Friday. And then sort of depending on how that all taps out, we'll probably start the lecture for today, which I posted late last night. That just seems to be like when I can get this stuff done. But first things first, I got to grade your exams last night and you all did excellent. I didn't even look at the average, but 15 of you got an A- or above. And then the other two folks were within that, range. Nobody failed. So that was pretty darn awesome. I'm super proud of y'all. And I'm always totally okay with like everyone getting an A on an exam because you're showing me you know what you're talking about. So that's awesome. There were just a couple little things. One we'll re-review at the start of the next chapter, which is the hierarchy of scientific evidence. A couple people are still getting stuck on that. The only other thing, yeah, it should be able to show you all the answers now. And in fact, I think as soon as you turned it in, it let you see all the answers. So you should be able to look on left and see them.
You have to click on your score. That's the way you can get to it. I had the hardest time for a long time, but you have to click on like your actual number score on the right hand side.
Thank you for that information. That's really helpful because I don't see what you all see. So that's awesome. Thanks, Debbie, and hopefully that'll be helpful, Oliver. Yeah, so I have little blurbs of correct answers there. Honestly, things people missed, like I said, besides the hierarchy of evidence, the one that the most people missed, I would say, was on the first scenario. People missed that the very first sentence of that article mentioned something about Aboriginal peoples, which, you know, has that racism in it. So I think about maybe half or a third of you noticed that, and a lot of people missed it, but found other nice ways to talk about race in the context of the information given. So yeah, it's all about kind of reading between the lines, right? And seeing what exists and seeing what they are either saying or implying about races that are not ours, right? And one thing that's important to remember is that racism doesn't have to be blatantly negative, if that makes sense. So like the thing about the Aboriginals, it was just like, this was honored by Aboriginal people. Like, that's still racism, right? If you're implying that anything is different because of, you know, some sort of like magic attuned to them, just as much as it's racism to assume that someone of Asian American descent is automatically good at math, right? And so that was, like I said, the only big thing that people miss in general. Y'all do really well with everything. I especially, as I did in class, really enjoyed seeing your responses to the social media posts. I think, as I said, you all have the fortune or misfortune, depending on how you want to look at it, of having grown up with social media. And so you're very savvy at what you're looking at. Whereas, you know, social media, Facebook, I joined like near the beginning in 2005, but I was in grad school then, right? So like I didn't grow up with that. So, you know, and people had MySpace before that. I never did, but it certainly was a thing that existed. So you all have, again, the fortune of having grown up kind of knowing how to critique it, but also the misfortune of all the negatives that come along with growing up in the age of social media. Good question, Debbie, because I did have AIM in college. So that was AOL Instant Messenger. Debbie and I are dating ourselves. So, and I had email in high school, but that was about like the extent of where I was. So, alrighty. So like I said, where I'd love to pick up is with our group activity. So let me go ahead and screen share that. We'd had our first group go and had walked us through their IRB. And I think I had shared that this one actually was one that when I was on our IRB, I actually reviewed, and you know, I did exactly what group one said. I said, no, you can't do this, stop. So I very much appreciate that you all had the same reaction I did. All right, group two, tell us briefly about what your scenario was, and then how you all answered the questions. And so this was Julia, Will, and Imani.
So our scenario was pretty much about trying to condition a fear response in a child who already had a known fear response to loud noises, but none known to animals. And all of us pretty much agreed while we were reading this sounded like just Little Albert redone.
It is. This is Little Albert.
So, of course, that was extremely unethical for many reasons. So one of the number one things that we said was that you could potentially traumatize the kid and have some lifelong consequences, because at no point does it say anything about unconditioning these responses. So we said that we would definitely not approve an experiment like this. And a big revision that we would want to see is some provisions to reverse the conditioned fear response, and maybe even a follow-up in a few years just to check up on how things are going. Then we said they could potentially analyze different responses to stimuli that didn't produce a conditioned fear response, and maybe see if there was anything else that he responded to that same way that they didn't have to manipulate. And like I said, follow up over time so that they could see how these fears changed. And then for the final question, we said, yes, an IRB is important to avoid experiments just like this.
Yeah, that's great. Yep, this is Little Albert. This is a description of a classic study for those of you who might not be as familiar with it, where John Watson, the well-known American behaviorist, did in fact condition a child to do this along with his grad student Rosalie Rayner, who he later left his wife for. And because at that time divorce had a lot of stigma, he never had a job in academia again, which is really interesting. But yeah, this is not great. We don't want to be traumatizing children without any sort of provisions. And there's been sort of a back and forth in the psychological, historical literature. There's a research group that thought they tracked Little Albert down and found out he had later died of encephalitis. No, hydrocephalus. But then there was another group that was like, no, that wasn't him, it was this person. So who knows whatever happened to this poor kid. But yeah, you could just sort of see the not only how unethical this was, but there was definitely some classism built in. That was essentially like, well, his mom's a wet nurse, so he'll be fine. Yeah. Good job, group 2. All right, group 3 was Debbie and Ariana.
So our study was basically about, they wanted to know how good hospitals were at identifying people who weren't mentally ill. Basically, it's been a while since last week, so my memory of this might be a little bit hazy. So they basically put patients with no mental illness into mental hospitals to see if they could identify that they were not mentally ill. So the potential problems that we saw in regards to the patient safety and confidentiality was that the participants are putting themselves at risk being around other patients, because some patients do get violent, as well as the possibility of them giving them medication that they don't really need, which could lead to other health problems. There's also a breach of confidentiality, being that their treatments and potentially the treatments of other patients are used and reported to a public audience, which isn't really okay. We would not approve this proposal because this experience seems very unethical, because the 12 different hospitals are unaware that their participants and the experiment could possibly harm the participants going into the hospitals. We would mainly just ask the group to find a new way to study the topic. And other ways that they could do that is that they could potentially do an observational study of patients who are already in there and see how their treatment care works and how long it takes for them to be released. They could also ask hospitals directly if they can provide information on treatment plans they can use for patients who have auditory hallucinations. We believe that the IRB is important because people need to have faith in mental health experts and their ability to tell whether or not someone needs help.
Excellent. Yeah, yeah. And as Oliver said in the chat, yeah, this one's real too. This was done by a psychologist named Rosenhan, and the paper based on this was called "On Being Sane in Insane Places." So yeah, he actually sent like colleagues, grad students to do this, and they reported during their initial interview the exact symptoms described here. And then when they were done, once they got admitted, they stopped and they just tried to act like normal. And it was so interesting how like everything they did was interpreted through the lens of them being mentally ill. So like the fact that they were taking notes for the study, like the nurses would document in the chart, like they're paranoid. And it was so funny because the other patients figured it out. They're like, you work for the hospital, or you're like checking up on us, you're not crazy. But like the doctors and nurses could only see them through this lens. I think there was one person who ended up being there like 100 days or something, like the person had to help them get out. So yeah, it's really, about how like once someone has a diagnosis, right, then we can see them only that way sometimes, which is really problematic because they're still a whole person and they have the potential to recover, right? So a lot of modern ways of looking at therapy and diagnosis are really recovery based models. Even some of the like manualized treatments we use have switched their focus in that direction. Excellent job. All right, next we have Tacey Davin and Michaela. So tell us a little bit about your study and then how you answered the questions.
Basically the Stanford prison experiment. They had people volunteer to be prisoners, some people to be like the prison wardens, and they're just acting out both like, what is the word I'm looking for? Positions, I guess, that. So we said that some problems with this is people can go on ego trips when they have power to their name, and it could be harmful to other, like the people who are playing the prisoners, because those people could have harmed them and then physically, and it also can cause emotional health problems as well. As if we were going to be the IRB, we said that we didn't approve of it because like we've already seen what happened, and it caused a lot of damage to those people's like mental, physical health and stuff, for both people who played the prisoner and the people who were the prison guards. If we were to make like revisions to it, we'd say proper training before going in hand. And I believe Michaela had suggested like having people going in who are actually like have been through the training, who actually have that job in real life, but without telling people that they're in it. Like say they just signed up to be volunteers. And then like also have like those people give advice out as well. We think that it's important because like I'm sorry, it's early this morning. To learn from past mistakes, like that's why this is needed.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, this is the Stanford prison experiment. And this is often cited as one of the reasons why IRBs are so important, right? Exactly, we all pointed out, because he didn't have to go through the IRB process for this, and like he didn't really have an independent variable and a dependent variable. So yeah, not good. As you were just pointing out, there were people who were like traumatized by this experience. One of the people who played a prisoner ended up being a prison psychologist because this impacted him so deeply, right? I love the fake imprisonment of the scientists. That cracks me up. I've actually seen Zimbardo talk about this study. And it's like he hasn't really learned anything like he says he has, but then like he justifies it still. He's like, well, I would never have done my research, and my wife would never have done her research if we hadn't done this. So, whereas, pretty much anyone else with a pulse can be like, this was awful. What are you talking about? We didn't need to do this to get to that point. So excellent job, group 4. Alrighty, so last but not least, we have group 5, Brecken, Jade, and Henry. So go ahead and tell us the premise of your study, and then how you answered the questions.
So basically, they were doing a study on how caffeine affects your ability to focus and your short-term memory. So they had people some people drank Red Bull and other people drank Sprite. And then they did a couple of memorization tests on if they could list of words and stuff. And we basically said that the Red Bull is a very strong energy drink, and without participants being informed of what they're drinking, it could be potentially harmful to them because of the high levels of caffeine. We said that we would approve it if revisions were made, but this way that it was presented, we wouldn't. And then the revisions that we would make is we would add information regarding the caffeine levels, and we would change the time the study is performed, because it said that studies performed at nighttime, and that could mess with people's sleep schedules and stuff, because you shouldn't really be drinking caffeine at night. And we also said that we would give the same participant different drinks over a period of time, because you can't really judge memory based on one person drinking caffeine and a different person not drinking caffeine, because everyone's memory and how they remember things is different. And we think that IRB is important because without it, the research community would be lacking a vital safety measure against unethical research and experiments.
Great. Yeah, exactly. Spot on. This was another one that actually happened at VWU. And this is the only time since I've been here that we had an IRB proposal that almost went to full board review. So just to give you a quick overview of how the process works at Wesleyan, there are 3 levels. Level 1 is you're using archival data that's already collected to answer a research question. Typically, that's called exempt, and the IRB will just sort of glance over it and then be like, you're good, you're approved. The second level is where most of our studies, both by professors and students, will fall. And so this is you're doing a study that's, basically if there's any risk factors, it's risk factors you would have filling out paperwork or something, right? You might get eye strain from the computer, things like that. And then level 3 is reserved for things that could potentially bring some harm and you have to really look and mitigate. And so, and for all the reasons that group 5 brought up, right? The fact that someone could have an underlying condition that would be affected by this. And so what they did is they had her revise her protocol in a lot of the same ways you suggest. So she had to make sure she had contact information for an on-call medical professional. I think it was the nurse's office at that point, and do it at times that that the nurse was available. And I think she also had to have an exclusion criteria for certain medical conditions as well. So yeah, you all would be great IRB reviewers because it's the exact same thing that we told her. And she actually ended up doing the study, and she said it was really fun because you know, she's obviously not actually giving people anything that could harm them, but like, because they didn't know which they were getting, they'd be like, what's in here? And like, some people thought she was giving them alcohol, giving you alcohol. And she did actually find a difference, if I recall, that the people with, that took the Red Bull actually did slightly worse. It was like they were having a hard time paying attention. But again, as the group pointed out, very short-term study. So, you know, we can't draw any sweeping conclusions from it. But yeah, great job, everybody. Thanks for being willing, as a couple of you pointed out, early on a Monday morning to revisit something we did on a Friday. I appreciate that. Okay, so let's dive in to the rest of our lecture from the other day. So I'm gonna go ahead and stick this in presentation mode. And I am going to start with, I think I kind of like mentioned this video in passing the other day, but this is really good. So I do want to show you this video where they actually like scammed a scam journal, a predatory journal, just to give you some indication of what predatory journals are like.
We trapped a predatory journal.
Come along to see what happened. You said you just wanted money. You said this was just business. Is this business? Is this how you do business?
In March 1665, a seemingly small thing happened. The first scientific journal was published. A printed version of the papers and letters read at the Royal Society meetings were published, and that was born of the first scientific journal, Philosophical Transactions. The first decades of its publication saw many memorable papers, including Isaac Newton's first publication. The success of the Philosophical Transactions inspired the birth of many other journals, all for one purpose: contributing to the knowledge and imparting it to one another. Nowadays, almost all advances in science find their way onto the pages of a scientific journal. Today, there are thousands of peer-reviewed journals publishing millions of articles a year. Gradually, journal publication flourished into the premier mechanism for evaluating researchers' performance, so that their job targets, income, bonus, and promotion are tied to their publications. Meanwhile, publishing in high-impact journals has become more competitive. All these have motivated some researchers and postgraduate students to pay to have their work published for the sake of career progression or graduation. Such an environment has contributed to the growth of predatory journals. Predatory journals accept and publish almost any paper just for money without properly reviewing them, and in many cases faking the peer review process. In this video, we intend to prove predatory journals literally accept any for the sake of money. To do so, we prepared a nonsense manuscript in less than half an hour by putting together random sentences from random papers. Who can be the best corresponding author for the paper which seeks to challenge the predatory journal's mafia? Zulema, a rebellious character of a Spanish TV series, Vis a Vis or Locked Up.
Mi nombre es Zulema Zair.
We created an email address for Zulema and submitted our manuscript to a predatory journal using her name. And for your information, the selected journal was a Scopus Index journal.
What's the topic about?
The topic. Okay, we need something fancy.
Something on online learning.
Virtual reality, sustainability.
We want to use all the trendy words.
Yeah,
in that.
the effectiveness of immersive virtual reality. The effectiveness of immersive virtual reality in sustainable online learning.
Does it make any sense?
Not sure.
Saeed was in charge of methods and results while I was preparing introduction and discussion. First, we searched a topic in Google Scholar to select some papers randomly. Then, we copied some haphazard paragraphs from each paper to put them together and make our manuscript.
From 1 to 10, tell me a number.
2.
Yeah, so I go to the second page. And now again from 1 to 10, one number.
3.
Okay, I open this first. Okay, another number.
4. 1. Okay, I think we have already enough for the introduction section. So it's almost done. We have done our literature review or the introduction section.
Said also inserted some irrelevant fancy graphs in the result section. Even we didn't stop there, and we replaced some of the citations with funny names such as Said's pet names, Hollywood actors and actresses, and even Donald Trump.
My pet's name, Johnson.
Here,
With?
my sister name.
Okay. Oh, let's add the name of 2 good friends. Number 1 is Donald Trump. So add Trump 2019, and Kim Jong-un. Who is your favorite actor or actress?
Zeta Jones.
Okay, add Zeta Jones.
Yeah.
Zeta Jones, now you have a paper.
Very recent.
Very recent, 2021, on e-learning. You can add it in your CV now.
The whole manuscript was ready in less than 30 minutes. To make sure that we won't be caught with any plagiarism software, we use a free online paraphrasing website to reword all sentences. No need to mention how ridiculous the sentences turn out to be. Finally, we submitted it and the game started. Said, I have a news for you. Zulema's paper is accepted.
Seriously? Zulema's paper has been accepted for publication. The journal has asked for $400 publication fees, but of course we will end the game here. You can find the submitted manuscript and the acceptance letter through the link posted in the description of this video.
I have also seen online things of predatory journals where someone just literally copies the same sentence over and over and they accept it. And the reason I was laughing so hard when they said the paper was accepted is depending on the caliber of the journal, it can take months to get things back. So my highest caliber pub is in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology. And when I initially submitted it, I believe it took 8 months to get our first round of reviews back. And then it's very typical within academic publishing for you to have to revise and resubmit it. That's just almost like standard. Like if you don't have to do that, it's super, super rare and you're just like the best writer ever, basically. And then you wait a couple more months after you do that, and then you might hear that it's accepted for publication. So the fact that it was like a few days later, and they're like, it's accepted, right? Very problematic. And like, this was a pretty low publication fee. I mean, $400 is still absurd to like pay us to publish this junk paper. But in fact, other places will charge like $2,000, for example, to publish a paper. And because, especially in academia, a lot of your job is contingent on you publishing. So for, to get hired, to get tenure, to get promoted, you have to show a track record of publishing consistently. Some early career people in particular succumb to this just so that they can like have those things on their CV. You may have heard the phrase publish or perish previously. And that can be sort of in line with this. So.
We trapped a predatory journal.
There's another video about it. If you want to watch it later, you can. but thinking about what we talked about Friday, and then also the video we just watched, what are your thoughts on open science in general, recognizing that most of open science is not predatory journals, right? And its accessibility both to readers and to researchers who are trying to publish. What are your thoughts?
I think it's interesting that it's so hard to publish. Like, I understand why, but at the same time, I don't know, I think it like makes people want to like find loopholes like predatory journals. Like, I was watching this show the other day, and in the show they were trying to like correlate prayer and like healing, and like it was really interesting, like whatever, but like halfway through the show, the student who they're following finds out that the people in like the two groups didn't know each other. Like, it wasn't a blind study like she thought it was, and she goes and she reports it to her higher up, and then she realizes her higher up was part of it, so she goes to report it to like the main doctor, like the head honcho, and he looks at her and he's just like, yeah, so I need funding, basically. And it was just really interesting because even with like the people knowing each other, I felt like he would have had something really cool to publish, but because he didn't think that what he had to publish was going to get funded, he would rather like just cheat his way out of it or into it, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, Aaron. And I want to say, just like with most journals not predatory, right? Most scientists are not that unethical, but you can certainly see, again, as Aaron was implying, sort of the lure of doing that, right? Just trying to get something out there. Like, I have had numerous, 3, I think, publications in the past 4 years or so that I've submitted and they just said, nope, sorry, man, right? And even as someone who knows this is the process, that's always really disheartening. And so like, I keep going, but there are people who stop because they're like, I keep putting myself through this. Alrighty. I don't know how many of you, I know when I was looking at this last week, not many people had actually read through the perusal for this. But basically, to give you a summary of the study, if you didn't get a chance to look at it yet. So this was a study where they took a whole bunch of pre-existing studies and then they reran them. And they basically were trying to see, what would they be able to replicate it? So this goes back to that replicability. Jeez, there we go. Crisis that we talked about earlier in the semester. So let me here. I can click into perusal and just show you the piece real quick. For those of you again who haven't had a chance to do it. So what are your initial reactions when you see the author list?
I honestly never even read them. They just look like way too many words that I most likely can't pronounce.
Yeah, and that's something that a lot of people don't necessarily naturally do. I did like that several of you on your exam said like that would be one of the first thing you'd look at for a paper is like who wrote it. Does it seem like they're legit? Yeah. It does show their credentials. So this is pretty typical, especially when you have a lot of authors, where there will be footnotes basically that shows you where they are from. So this is an international study, so they're kind of from all over. So like Taiwan University, University of Salford, Grand Valley State University. So there's some in the US, San Diego State University, University of Brasilia, so down in Brazil. So very, yeah. David, I like that. There's many more years of school than an entire lifetime. Definitely. Yeah. Well, and like, they would combine all the data and whatnot. And on things like this, you typically have sort of main authors who lead the way. But yeah, I mean, this is more and more becoming the standard. I am currently on a study. Let me see if I can find the most recent. Here we go. Update from Byron. I actually collected my data last week for this study. I need to get it to him. We have 71 countries. Oh, he doesn't say how many authors we have. But you can imagine multiple authors in each country. It's going to end up with like hundreds of authors. But it's going to be a really cool large scale study that they'll be able to combine like this. So for those of you who did get a chance to read it, do you remember what changes they made as they were trying to replicate these studies? And I'll scroll to the method while folks are thinking. So this was the table that addressed that. And some of it was, they were doing them online instead of paper and pencil. Right. Some of the things they changed were terminology that would make more sense for that location. Sometimes they changed bigger things, right? And so like they're replicating it, right? But like they are making some changes and they're fully transparent about that, right? But whenever I see something like this, right? So like this, they only used a subset of the scenarios that were originally used in the article, right? Then to me, it's like, well, of course you couldn't exactly replicate the results, right? Because you change, and any small things you would change in a study can happen. And so I think that's part of what is playing into this last question, certainly not all of it. All right, we did the IRB assignment, and again, just sort of a review of this is who is on our IRB currently. All righty. So let me go ahead and get our new lecture into presentation mode here. And we can have about 10 minutes to start to dive into some of this. And so chapter 6, I enjoy your book very much. And the title of the chapter is actually Things We Know That Ain't So. It's just a little creative, a little fun. And I wanted to start by reviewing this because again, some people seem to get stuck on this on the exam, and it's also relevant to this week's readings. So again, if you haven't had a chance to look at Perusal 6, I believe yet, go ahead and look in it, and then always remember to check when you get to the bottom of the first reading, because there might be multiple readings. There are in this case. This is your second reading for the day, is a little more about this. First things first, just from the assignments that some of you turned in last week, again, if you haven't had a chance to do that yet, please do it. It will help you going forward with your project. And please contact me if you have any questions about it. But some of you were pulling websites, for example, as a source. No, that's not what we're looking for. We're not looking for those for scientific evidence, right? Even YouTube videos, even if the YouTube video is an interview with the author of a great paper, right? Instead, what you want to do is go and actually find that paper. So again, personal anecdotes, gut feelings, parental instincts, some guy right? Nicki Minaj's cousin's friend, right? Those are all things you don't want to consider as scientific evidence. Instead, you want to look here. And again, anything on the spectrum is potentially helpful. It's just there are the strongest scientific evidence for that particular point, the higher up the pyramid you get. So I realized, again, reading your exams, that some of you, were just kind of stuck on like what kind of study was which. And so I thought that I would kind of go over that in a little more detail. So I'm actually going to go over this in reverse order of what's on here. So this is the pyramid essentially broken down. And I'm just going to start at the bottom so we can see what's weaker and work our way up to what is stronger. So case reports, opinion papers, and letters. Case reports are also called case studies. And for those, you have one participant. And so these can be the start of further study. It also, like if you have a really rare condition, this can be sometimes the only way you can study it. But you can't generalize from it at all, okay? Case reports or case studies, it's just a jumping off point. Obviously, opinion papers and letters to the editor are just that, right? They are certainly bringing in some scientific evidence at points, but they're explicitly stating that this is someone's opinion rather than necessarily exactly what the science says. So for example, when I teach abnormal psychology, I talk about a paper that was kind of put into the editorial section of a journal about essentially said that schizophrenia comes from a virus from cats. And they didn't, all of their evidence was really tenuous at best. It was like, well, schizophrenia happens more in cities and there are more cats in cities. It's like, there's also just, more people and more people who are struggling with some of the socioeconomic conditions that can exacerbate something like a psychotic disorder, right? So that was in the like opinion editorial section. I love that study because I think there's a tendency, knee-jerk tendency in science in general and in psychology in particular to assume if it's a biologically based rationale, right, that must be better than other things. And that's a clear example of a case where that is not true, right? Okay, so then animal trials and in vitro studies, animal trials would be actually taking animals, rats, mice, what have you. We used to do a lot more research on primates. Some of it still happens, but a lot of that has been sort of pulled back. Or you're actually working with cells and molecules in petri dishes, right? So maybe working on something like, medication trials in an animal, or looking at behavioral things in animals. The reason these are so low, again, it's not because they're not difficult to do or they're not scientifically valid. It's just, unless you're actually like your main goal, right, is to find out about animals, right? This isn't actually that generalizable, right? These are often sort of the baseline. You do these first before you start human trials for something, right? And so that's why these are lower. Cross-sectional studies is a lot of what you'll see in psychology. So again, doesn't mean these are bad. And in fact, I think the vast majority of the research I've done are these. So you look at one time point with questionnaires, or you might go through medical records, for example, or educational records, and you draw some conclusions based on statistics you do from the data gathered at one time point. Now, why these are considered less good is because there's only one point in time. There's a lot of things that could affect it. And questionnaires often ask people to remember something that happened in the past. We call that retrospective report, and people aren't always good at that. Case control studies are also called quasi-experiments. And basically, it's like you do everything like you're doing an experiment, but it's based on an independent variable you can't randomly assign. So if you wanted to compare on gender, for example, we cannot randomly assign someone to be a particular gender. We cannot randomly assign someone to have depression, right? So these allow you to compare existing groups and try to control everything else. Cohort studies, I've most often see these called longitudinal studies. Sometimes they're called prospective studies. This is where you take a group at one time point and then you follow that same group over time. This really is one of the nicest ways to see, like, in the real world, what develops before what. So there's some gorgeous longitudinal studies in my subfield about where they looked at, you know, kids sort of pre-adolescence and then through high school, and they found that things like body image disturbance, for example, developed before disordered eating. We'd always sort of guessed that, but like, it's hard to do with a cross-sectional study, right? Because you don't have a time point. So these can be super helpful. Randomized control trials are experiments. These are considered the gold standard for research. And ideally they're placebo controlled. So the idea is, let's say we're trying a new type of therapy, right? We would randomly assign people to either get the therapy or some sort of placebo. That's hard to figure out for therapy. A lot of times we do what we call a wait list control, where someone's just on a wait list until basically a therapist in the study opens up and then they get to go over. But for medication, it would be a literal placebo, a literal sugar pill most of the time. And then you can actually see what's working and what's not. And then the top, and what was on your exam, the journal article that was on your exam, was a meta-analysis / systemic review. So this is the top of the top, because what you do with a meta-analysis is you take other published studies and you synthesize their data. So you bring together a lot of existing published studies. And there were a couple of folks who were like, well, this seems like it happened too fast, or there's not that many studies, I'm not sure. Science sometimes has to go fast, right? And particularly in the age of COVID, we're seeing things about COVID get published much more quickly. They're still going through the peer review process, just peer reviewers are given less time to review to keep things coming out in a timely manner. Meta-analyses allow you to see overall trends that might be disguised by small sample sizes or something particular about the site where one study was done that doesn't apply in other areas, for example. So meta-analyses really are, like, if you can do one of these, it's going to get cited a lot. My meta-analysis I published in 2009 has been cited almost 700 times, for example. And it really can contribute to the literature. It really can help take a step back from individual studies and say what's going on overall. And you can find some pretty surprising things there. So for example, a lot of the ways people look at social comparison within my subfield is they'll show people images and they'll just like assume they're comparing themselves to that. But what my meta-analysis in 2009 showed is that relationships were weaker when they did that. Essentially, it's like maybe people aren't always comparing themselves in their scenarios if they're not explicitly told to do so. Alrighty, well, we will stop there for today and we'll dive back into this lecture on Wednesday. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so I can see all your lovely squares. And then hopefully Wednesday, Friday, we'll be on Zoom for sure. Hopefully Monday, everything will go well with my test and I will be able to be back in person with y'all. I'll hang around for a minute in case anyone has any questions. If not, I will see y'all later.